Tense music fills the studio as the cameras focus on Richard, a 35-year-old man with red eyes and clenched fists. The audience's silence is almost deafening. On the screens in the background, old images show a smiling little boy Richard at age 5, the last age he ever saw his mother. Phil walks across the stage, observing his guest with an analytical gaze. There's something different about his demeanor today. 30 years of abandonment, 30 years of unanswered questions. Today's case is not just another family drama, it is an open wound that never healed. Richard, you were raised by your paternal grandparents since the age of 5. They told you your mother simply vanished. No calls, no letters, nothing for 30 years. How has that affected your life? Richard takes a deep breath, his shoulders heavy with decades of doubt. Dr. Phil, I grew up wondering what was wrong with me. What 5-year-old kid makes his own mother run away? For the first few years, I'd run to the door whenever I heard a knock. I thought it was her coming back. He runs a hand through his hair, trying to maintain composure. At birthday parties, I always left a slice of cake untouched, just in case she showed up. At my graduations, at my wedding, always looking at the door, always waiting. My wife says she's never seen me truly happy. There's always something missing. The camera pans to the left side of the stage, where an elderly woman with trembling hands holds a wooden box in her lap. Helen Stone, 65, gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, avoids looking at her son. Her fingers nervously caress the worn surface of the box as she keeps her eyes fixed on the floor. Helen, Dr. Phil approaches her with measured steps. You haven't seen your son in 30 years. You walked out of his life when he was only 5. A child who depended on you, who loved you. Now he's here, an adult man scarred by your abandonment. Why? Helen lifts her eyes briefly, then drops them again. Her voice is barely a whisper. I don't deserve forgiveness. Phil. I don't expect it. I just wanted him to know. It wasn't his fault. She clutches the box to her chest like a shield. It wasn't his fault, Doctor. Phil repeats, his voice emphasizing every word. Then whose fault was it? Helen. Because someone has to answer for 30 years of silence. 30 years. The audience remains in absolute silence. The cameras capture Richard's profile, a vein pulsating in his temple, his knuckles white from gripping the armchair. Doctor. Phil strategically positions himself between mother and son, creating a visible triangle of tension on stage. His posture is firm, his penetrating gaze returns to Helen. Helen, you abandoned your 5-year-old son. You walked out the door and never came back. Not a phone call on Christmas, not a birthday card, nothing. He gestures toward the box on her lap. And now you come to my show with this mysterious box. What are you hiding? What could possibly justify 3 decades of abandonment? Helen takes a deep breath, her shoulders trembling. I was young, Phil. Only 30 years old. Richard's father died in a car accident, hit by a drunk driver. Her voice falters. It was sudden, unexpected. One day we had a happy family. The next, I was a widow with a small child. Many people lose their spouses. Helen, Doctor. Phil interjects bluntly. They don't abandon their children. The depression. Helen continues, ignoring the interruption. It was like a black hole swallowed me. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I spent days unable to get out of bed. Richard was alone, feeding himself dry cereal because I couldn't even make it to the kitchen. Richard watches his mother with a mixture of anger and confusion. You could have asked for help. I tried. Helen responds, looking at her son for the first time. I tried for months. Doctors gave me medication that left me dizzy, unable to care for you. His grandmother came on weekends, but it wasn't enough. Doctor. Phil crosses his arms and shakes his head, his skepticism visible. And then what? What happened next, Helen? Because we are talking about 30 years, not a few difficult months. Helen slowly opens the wooden box. The sound of the hinge creaks through the silent studio. Letters, she says. 1 letter for every birthday. 1 letter for every Christmas. 1 letter for every important moment I imagined in his life, his high school graduation, college, his wedding. You wrote letters, Doctor. Phil asks, his voice mixing disbelief and curiosity. 306 to 7 letters, Helen confirms. I never had the courage to send them. Richard abruptly stands up. His body visibly shakes. The audience collectively gasps. You wrote letters? For 30 years? And you never sent any? He screams. What kind of cruelty is that? Richard, please, Doctor. Phil raises his hand to calm him. No, I want to understand this. Richard yells, pointing at the box. You knew where I was all this time. You knew my address to send those letters, but you chose not to. You had my number, you knew how to find me, and still you preferred to keep writing letters I would never read. Helen lowers her head, tears falling onto the box. I didn't deserve to come back into your life, she whispers. Not after what I did. That wasn't your decision to make. Richard stomps his foot. It was mine. It was my right to know. It was my right to choose if I wanted you back or not. Dr. Phil watches the interaction, allowing the tension to build naturally after a few moments of charged silence. He approaches Helen again. These letters, he says, pointing at the box, are they just excuses, Helen? Or is there something more you never told your son? Helen runs her fingers over the yellowed envelopes, chronologically organized and tied with different colored ribbons, blue for birthdays, red for Christmases, green for presumed special moments. Her hands shake uncontrollably as she selects one specific envelope, marked in vibrant red, separated from the others. This one, she says, her voice almost inaudible, is the last letter. The one I wrote last week, when I found out I would be here. It's the only one that matters now. Richard looks at the envelope with suspicion. The entire audience seems to lean forward, as if they could somehow see the contents through the paper. Doctor, Phil accepts the envelope with a neutral expression. Here's a practice in maintaining his composure in the face of the most shocking revelations. You want me to read this here, live? Helen nods slowly. Please. I can't say the words. The tension is palpable as Dr. Phil carefully opens the envelope. The paper tears slightly at the edge, the sound amplified by the studio microphones. He removes a carefully folded sheet, with elegant but shaky handwriting covering both sides. His eyes quickly scan the lines. The audience watches, mesmerized, as Dr. Phil's expression subtly changes, first confusion, then comprehension, and finally, something rarely seen on his face, genuine shock. Phil lifts his eyes from the letter, looking first at Helen, then at Richard. For the first time in 22 years on the air, the therapist seems to momentarily lose his professional composure. He looks at the off-camera production and makes an abrupt gesture, cutting the air with his hand. Stop the cameras, he orders, his voice firm but urgent. Now, stop the taping. Confusion erupts in the studio. Red lights flash on the cameras, signaling the interruption. The audience murmurs. Producers rush back and forth. The main lights abruptly cut out, leaving only the emergency lights on. Dr. Phil, still holding the letter, walks quickly to Richard. He places a hand on the man's shoulder and whispers something in his ear, words inaudible to the cameras, to the audience, to everyone but Richard. Richard's face transforms. Anger gives way to shock, then disbelief, and finally a pain so deep it seems physical. His legs give out, and Dr. Phil helps him sit down again. Everyone out. Dr. Phil instructs his team, his voice echoing through the now half-dark studio. Clear the studio. Now. 15 minutes later, the studio is almost empty. The audience has been politely but firmly ushered out. Only Dr. Phil, Helen, Richard, and a minimal production crew remain. A single camera continues to record, now capturing an intimate, almost invasive moment. Helen is openly weeping, her face buried in her hands. Richard holds the letter with trembling hands, reading and rereading the words that have just reconfigured 3 decades of his life. Richard, Dr. Phil begins, his voice softer now, no longer needing to project to an audience. What your mother revealed in that letter is not something I could allow to be exposed without preparation, without privacy. Richard looks at Dr. Phil, then at Helen. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why wait 30 years? Dr. Phil places a hand on Richard's shoulder. Your mother didn't just leave you at age 5. She did so because she was diagnosed with a severe bipolar disorder at a time when treatments were far more limited than today. The week before she left, she attempted suicide. Twice. Richard pales. What? I didn't want you to see me like that, Helen says, her voice choked. I loved you too much to let you witness what I was going through. I had thoughts, terrible thoughts. Sometimes, in my worst moments, I imagined taking you with me. The silence that follows is deafening. Richard's hand grips the letter so tightly the paper crumbles. Your mother was institutionalized in a psychiatric facility for nearly 3 years after leaving you, Dr. Phil continues. Your grandparents knew about this, Richard. They visited her occasionally. My grandparents knew? Richard's voice is a shocked whisper. They told me you abandoned us, that you had a new family, a new life. Helen shakes her head, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. They thought it would be better that way. When I was finally discharged, 3 years later, they told me you were well-adjusted, happy, that revealing the truth would only bring the trauma back. They prevented you from seeing me? Richard asks incredulously. They begged me to stay away, Helen confirms. They said you didn't need a crazy mother in your life, that it would be easier for you to hate me than to be afraid of me. Doctor. Phil opens the box again and pulls out another envelope, this one much older, yellowed, and fragile. This is the original letter, Richard. The one your mother wrote 30 years ago, the farewell letter she never delivered. Richard accepts the envelope with shaking hands, but doesn't open it. And this last letter? The one you just read? Why now, after all this time, Doctor? Phil looks at Helen, allowing her to answer. Because I'm dying, Richard. Her voice is surprisingly steady. Terminal cancer. Stage 4. The doctors gave me 6 months to live, tops. This is my last chance to see you. My last chance to ask for forgiveness. Richard stares fixedly at the fragile woman before him, this stranger, who is his mother. 30 years, he whispers. We lost 30 years. I know, Helen replies, her voice breaking. And that's why I'm here. Not to ask you to forgive me. Not to ask for a place in your life in the months I have left. Just so you know that I never, not for a second, stop loving you. 2 hours have passed since the dramatic interruption. The cameras are rolling again, but the format is different now. There is no audience, no elaborate production characteristic of the show. It's almost like an intimate documentary. Richard and Helen are sitting side by side on the sofa. They are not embracing. There are no dramatic displays of instant reconciliation. But there is something new between them, the beginning of an understanding, perhaps even the first fragile thread of a reconnection. In these letters, Helen says, touching the box is everything I wanted to tell you, every moment I missed, every time I thought of you, the nights I imagined what your voice would sound like, what your face would look like. Richard looks at the box, then at his mother. That's a lot of letters for someone who planned never to deliver them. Writing to you was the only way I found to keep being your mother, Helen explains. Even if it was just in my head. Doctor. Phil watches the interaction with respect, intervening only occasionally. Richard, what are you feeling now, after everything you discovered today? Richard considers the question for a long moment. Confused. Sad. Maybe even a little relieved. My whole life, I thought I wasn't worthy of being loved. That there was something wrong with me that made my own mother not want me. He takes a deep breath. Now I find out I was loved the whole time. That my mother left because she was sick, not because I wasn't enough. And what about the anger, Doctor? Phil asks. For the lost years? It's still here, Richard admits. But I no longer know who to direct it at. My grandparents, for hiding the truth? The illness that took my mother from me? The system that couldn't adequately help her? He looks at Helen. It's more complicated now. Helen reaches out, hesitantly, and lightly touches her son's hand. It is the first physical contact between them in 30 years. No matter how much time I have left, she says, I would like to get to know you. To get to know the man my son has become. The scene changes. Doctor. Phil walks through the empty studio, toward a single camera. His expression is contemplative, his step slow. When he finally speaks, his voice carries the weight of someone who has just witnessed a human tragedy that could have been avoided. Today, I did something I've never done in over 2 decades on the air. I stopped the taping, because there are times when the truth is so raw, so painful, that it needs to be processed in private before it can be shared with the world. He stops in the center of the studio, looking directly at the camera. Helen and Richard's story reminds us that behind every abandonment, there is a story we don't know. Behind every closed door, there is a person struggling with demons we cannot see. Mental health still carries a stigma in our society. 30 years ago, that stigma was even greater, more debilitating. Helen was a victim of that stigma, unable to ask for the help she needed, fearing judgment, fearing losing her son if she admitted the depth of her illness. Doctor. Phil walks closer to the camera, his voice intensifying. And then, when she finally received treatment, well-meaning gatekeepers, Richard's grandparents, made a decision that would change the course of 2 lives. They chose the protective lie over the painful truth. They chose to hide the mental illness, perpetuating the very stigma that caused the problem in the first place. Oftentimes, our biggest judgment comes from a lack of information. 30 years of pain could have been avoided if the truth had been shared. Hard truths may hurt, but protective lies destroy lives for generations. That is the biggest takeaway I have from this case. A series of split-screen photos appear Richard as a child, Helen in her younger years, then a recent photo of them both, side by side in the studio. In the months following this taping, Richard would visit Helen regularly in the hospital. He would read every one of the 367 letters she wrote over the 30 years and emotional journey through time, reclaiming fragments of a mother-son relationship that never had a chance to blossom. The camera briefly shows Helen in a hospital bed, pale but smiling, as Richard reads aloud one of the old letters. Helen passed away 5 months after this taping. Richard was holding her hand in her final moments. Dr. Phil returns to the screen, alone in the now half-dark studio. The truth, however painful it may be, is the only path to genuine healing. If there's one lesson to be learned here, it is this: do not put off until tomorrow the words that need to be said today. Do not let the fear of judgment stop you from seeking help when you need it most. The studio lights gradually dim. Dr. Phil remains silent for a moment before his final sentence. Sometimes, the most important letters are the ones we never get to read. And sometimes, it's never too late to finally deliver them. Good night. The studio goes completely dark. In the final credits, a note informs that Helen Stone passed away peacefully on January 12, 2026, with her son by her side. A charitable fund for bipolar disorder research and treatment was established in her name, in memory of Helen Stone, 1960 to 2026 mother, in every letter never sent.